Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this second discussion of Robinson Crusoe, which involves several critical aspects, really. What am I going to talk about today? I'm going to discuss three myths that Robinson Crusoe has been identified with. The first myth being the myth of the dignity of labor. And here, Karl Marx commented on Robinson Crusoe. I'll talk about the myth of the Homo Economicus, or the economic man. And I'll talk about the myth of Robinson Crusoe as going back to nature, a return to nature, or the natural man. So these are some of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. A reasonably dense mix of affairs. Now, the concept of these three myths actually draws from Ian Watt's idea that Robinson Crusoe represents the characteristic aspirations of Western man, and that it is one of the texts that lives in the imagination, and I'm quoting Watt here, mainly as a triumph of human achievement and enterprise, and as a favorite example of the elementary process of political economy. Please note that word, political economy. And therefore, Watt goes on to say that Defoe's text is one of the ur-texts of Western modernity and has three essential themes of Western modern civilization. What are these three elements of modern civilization that Robinson Crusoe foregrounds? Watt says it is back to nature, the dignity of labor, and economic man. So let me repeat. Watt's idea is that Robinson Crusoe forms one of the three basic myths of modern man, that of Homo Economicus, that of the dignity of labor, and that of the theme of man and his relationship, intimate relationship with nature. So Robinson Crusoe as an example of going back to nature. Let me take these themes one by one, and let me talk about Crusoe as an example of the dignity of labor. Now, the entire idea comes back once again, back to Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in fact, in Das Kapital, has some very interesting comments to offer on Robinson Crusoe. He suggests that even though Crusoe is undemanding, and I'm using Marx's word here, undemanding, he still needs to satisfy, and this is within quotes, he still has needs to satisfy and must therefore perform useful labors of various kinds. What are these labors according to Marx? He must make tools, knock together furniture, tame llamas, fish, hunt, and so on. So Marx is making a catalogue of Crusoe's activities. And then he says, despite, and I'm quoting Marx again, despite the diversity of his productive functions, he knows that they are only different forms of activity of one and the same Robinson, hence only different modes of human labor. So within his body of Robinson Crusoe, he embodies different forms and types of human labor. Marx also goes on to add, our friend Robinson Crusoe learns this by experience, and having saved a watch, ledger, ink, and pen from the shipwreck. I had referred to, the textuality of Robinson Crusoe. Marx is drawing attention to that same fact. He soon begins, like a good Englishman, to keep a set of books. So a set of book keeping books like a businessman. His stock book contains a catalog of the useful objects he possesses, of the various operations necessary for their production, and finally of the labor time that specific quantities of these products have an average cost on an average costing. So not only is Defoe putting down the records of the objects that he has used, of the objects he has produced, but Crusoe is also meticulously putting in the account of human labor that has gone into it. Now, I had given you the example, if you remember, of making a boat and therefore cutting off an entire tree. So Defoe is putting in the labor cost. Now, therefore, Marx is suggesting that Robinson Crusoe becomes one of those fundamental texts of Western civilization which acknowledge the value of human labor and the dignity of human labor as the basic staple of production itself. So it is no longer a commodity exchange value, but the labor value which Defoe purely calculates. Now, there's another issue that goes on. Of course, Marx has one of the dismissive comments on Robinson Crusoe's spirituality. He says of his prayers and the like, "We take no account here, since our friend takes pleasure in them and sees them as recreation." So that's the major quote of his prayers and the like. We take no account here. Now, then, comes this idea that, work and labor in Robinson Crusoe is almost therapeutic in the sense that it allows him to remain sane on the island, and it allows his self-esteem also to grow, right? So, therefore, it is as it were asserting the fact and the Western idea that human labor is the most valuable form of human activity in itself. Now, the critic John Ricketty has also added to this, and he says that, the moments when Crusoe seems the happiest and most fulfilled, the least troubled by his anxieties and fears, and totally absorbed by his work, are his own technological breakthroughs. So there are moments in the text when the Crusoe, the innovator, takes center stage. And this is a moment when he's not isolated. He does not feel any anxiety or deep despair, but he takes great pleasure in making and crafting new things by himself. But, so the question remains, therefore, is Robinson Crusoe then the greatest example of, one, the primacy of human labor in human society, and two, a great document about the happiness and dignity of labor? That is the question. Now, there are certain points which we'll need to also consider. The first point is that Crusoe works because he must, in order to survive. So there's no love for work in Robinson Crusoe at all. It is a matter of bare survival. His production is not marked by any great love for the country or for himself or for the animals around. It is barely an act of survival, right? So there's no ulterior dignity of labor here. It is the issue of survival. Secondly, we also need to understand that Crusoe is out on an expedition to promote slavery, to buy and transact in slaves. So, and he's shipwrecked. But the fact remains, therefore, that Crusoe has no great regard for human labor. He merely sees this as a kind of, essential commodity that goes into the production of plantations. So there is no great dignity of labor. Rather, the human being is seen as a commodity that can be sold on and off the market. Now, the third thing is that, work and labor does not give him freedom from anxiety and solitude. That is to say, he enjoys his labor, but only because of his survival. And secondly, the more intense passages in the text talk about his anxiety, about his loneliness, about his desire for human company. So to say that Crusoe prioritizes labor over everything else and becomes a shining example of the dignity of labor would be false. And finally, labor in itself, therefore, for Crusoe, is just one of the ingredients of human capitalism. And Crusoe, the stakeholder in it, is perpetually looking to utilize abstract human labor in the process of more production. Now, nowhere is this more evident than in his treatment of Friday and Zuri. You see, Crusoe has, the great opportunity of fleeing from his slave owners because of Zuri. But the moment when he sees, and Zuri works tirelessly for him, but the moment when he sees a profit, he sells Zuri. And with Friday, he does not want Friday just as a companion, although that is there. But Friday's arrival is dreamt and looked forward to, because then Crusoe can dilute his own labor and put it off to Friday. So there's no love for labor in Crusoe. It's merely a thought about survival, although he does, innovate and continuously, put his labor in different ways. But to argue that Crusoe becomes a symbol of the dignity of human labor is probably false, because he engages in slavery, he works only to survive, and his solitude and anxieties far exceed his delight in labor. Further, in the treatment of Zuri and Friday, it is evident that Crusoe sees labor as only a means to an end. So, labor in itself has no real or great effect on Crusoe. It is only a means to an end of production, and therefore Crusoe is more of a capitalist than having any great belief in the dignity of human labor. Now, Crusoe would have probably ironically smiled at Karl Marx using him as an example in the analysis of the dignity of labor. So that's the myth of dignity of labor then. Now, is Crusoe a Homo Economicus? Now, what do we mean by the Homo Economicus? That is something we should need to understand first, but before we sort of plunge into a discussion on this topic. Now, you need to understand that the Homo Economicus is marked by the use of a rationality and self-interest, and marked by a desire to possess and optimize his condition with the least possible cost given perceived opportunities. Right? So, you see, there are certain aspects you need to associate with the Homo Economicus. It's not just merely economic man. It's an economic man who acts rationally. Rationality is one of the fundamental aspects of the Homo Economicus. Secondly, the Homo Economicus is always interested in self-interest and self-interested possession of further resources. But most importantly, the Homo Economicus seeks to optimize his assets and generate production and profit within the given opportunities. Right. Now, also, the Homo Economicus was associated with the concept of laissez-faire or free trade. Right. Now, immediately there are certain questions. Is Crusoe's island, and the most important objection to the Homo Economicus is that Crusoe's island is not an economic zone, in the sense that Crusoe lives alone. He has nobody to trade with. So how can we talk about Crusoe as an economic man? Now, let me take this one by one. If you take a look, very careful look at Crusoe when he arrives at the island, he looks at the island with a very rational, external eye. And let me read a part of the text for you. So I went to work, and here I must needs observe that as reason is the substance and original of mathematics, so by stating and squaring everything by reason, and by making the most rational judgment of things, every man may be in time master of every mechanic art. So Crusoe is emphasizing his rationality and his ability to cope with various situations and master every art. Now, what the island for Crusoe is an opportunity. The island for Crusoe is a resource. And how can he maximize his solitary stay on the island? He can work on this resource with the help of his tools and thereby start production. Now, you must understand that the difference between Selkirk and Crusoe, or the difference between other marooned people and Crusoe, is that Crusoe is not looking at only survival. You will remember that Selkirk very often thrived only on fishing and fruits. So it was a very bare model of subsistence. What Crusoe does is he looks at survival and then he consolidates. He creates a fortification. He creates rudimentary farming. He raises a kind of a poultry and an animal farm, thereby ensuring unlimited and uninterrupted supply of food. Then he discovers the shoots of corn, which we talked about in the discussion, textual discussion. And at that point of time, he becomes a baker, right? And he bakes his own bread and stores that bread. So, in a sense, Crusoe is gradually complicating the process of existence on the island from bare subsistence without anything. He gets tools, arms, and ammunition and starts rationally transforming bare existence into comfort and then into surplus. Now, having created this surplus, he then looks for further labor, which can then increase this surplus. So you can see an economic model emerging. And this is what Ian Watt draws to when he says that Crusoe's island gives him a complete laissez-faire, which economic man needs to realize his aims. At home, market conditions, taxations, and the problems of labor supply make it impossible for individuals to control every aspect of production, distribution, and exchange. So the barren island is barren from competitors and co-owners, and therefore Defoe builds on it a personal empire with the help of Man Friday, who needs no wages and makes it much easier to support the white man's burden. So in that sense, Defoe is one of those individuals who starts working on territory, resources rationally, and gradually engages in a process of consolidation. And therefore, even without trade, the model of the economic man as generating surplus, using labor, and creating a chain of production makes Robinson Crusoe a Homo economicus in that sense of the term. Therefore, building a kind of an economic system, even if he's not transacting in a very obvious way. Now, the other thing that I must talk about is his relationship with other people. Now, you need to understand that the Homo economicus is marked by fundamentally his economic vision. That the economic vision trumps all other factors. Now, if you look at Crusoe seems to be largely sanitized of any human emotion. Firstly and foremost, he has no associations with his family. He talks about his father and how he should have listened to his comment on his original sin. But then immediately Crusoe sort of dispels the father and runs away from him. There are references to his wife, but these are very casual references. There's no emotional attachment of Crusoe with any of the family members. How about the people around him? I've already talked about Zuri. He sort of uses Zuri when he feels the need to, and then immediately sells off Zuri. So there's no attachment to Zuri also. Now with Friday, there's a slight problem because Friday is the only man who can provide him with human company. But notice that, Crusoe also sees Friday without much emotion. He looks at Friday through himself. He never looks at Friday as a complete and separate human being with definite emotional connects. For example, he names Friday according to the day he sort of takes him. So he does not want to know any prehistory of Friday. Secondly, he calls himself master and names himself master rather for Friday. So the relationship that Crusoe foregrounds for Friday is not one of individual exchange and emotions. It is rather purely one of transaction. And therefore, there is a remarkable lack of interest in Friday as a person that Watt points out, and that Crusoe is a strict utilitarian. And it is this reductive aspect of human emotions and the predominance of the economic that makes Crusoe an example of a mythical Homo economicus. The economic motive becomes so important that relationships such as the family, the guide, the village, and sense of nationhood are all weakened by it. Right. In Defoe's novel, the protagonists either have no family, and this is true almost of all his novels, or leave the family at an early age, never to return to it. You can just take a look at the way in which Moll Flanders disposes of her husbands. Crusoe does have parents with whom he lives, but he leaves them from an economic motive, showing himself to be the Homo Economicus, solely directed towards improving his economic condition. And this, of course, culminates in the colonial endeavor, of which all of you are aware, and all of which I will discuss separately in another discussion. But the Homo Economicus and the question of slavery and colonialism are integrally related. So one leads to the other. So that then, I would say that instead of categorizing Crusoe as one who upholds the dignity of labor, the question of the Homo Economicus, Crusoe as a Homo Economicus, is far more possible. Now, it is a more viable mythical way of looking at Robinson Crusoe. Now, finally, I would like to take a look at this issue of Crusoe and the natural man. Is Crusoe an example of the man of nature, right? The man who is one with nature. Now, of course, this idea too has been derived from one of the major thinkers of the Enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau, in his book Emile, talks about his pupils' education within nature, solely directed by nature. And therefore, to achieve this, he says, all human books need to be sort of separated from Emile, bar one. And the one book that Rousseau is willing to allow Emile to read is Robinson Crusoe. Why? Because, it is the one book that teaches all that books can teach. So that's a huge claim that Rousseau is making, that Robinson Crusoe can teach everything that all other books can teach. Now, it's interesting in the sense that Rousseau also adds that Robinson Crusoe supplies the happiest, and I'm quoting Rousseau here, Robinson Crusoe supplies the happiest introduction to natural education. Happiest introduction to natural education, within quotes. For him, Crusoe is the archetype of man outside society, and the surest way of rising above prejudice and ordering one's opinions according to the real relations of things, according to the real relation of things. So Rousseau is taking away the economic motive. He says that Crusoe is the greatest way of introduction to natural education, the human relationship with nature, because Crusoe is outside society and he rises above all forms of prejudice and orders one's own opinions. Of course, the other aspect that Rousseau is talking about and fiercely talking about is Crusoe's freedom, absolute sense of freedom to do what he likes on the island. So then, is Robinson Crusoe an example of the human interaction, of the absolute human interaction with nature, where civilization does not encroach, where there is an empathetic bond between man and nature, where nature becomes Robinson Crusoe's teacher, just as in the way Rousseau imagines Emile to grow up within nature and nature to be the educator of Emile, both in terms of utility as well as in terms of emotions. Now, this is quite frankly very, very problematic, right? First and foremost is that, Defoe does not look at nature as an entity in itself. He is looking at nature as a resource. And therefore, Defoe writes that Crusoe applied myself to the works proper for my preservation and supply. So it's no longer nature. There's no love for nature within Robinson Crusoe. And there is, instead of natural empathy, there is the sense of possession. He says the whole country was my property, so that I had an undoubted right of dominion. So the relationship between Crusoe and nature is one of utility and dominion, one that asserts the human power over nature and consequently the human power to alter nature. So he is not an unbiased man in nature, and he observes nature not with the eyes of a pantheist primitive in love with nature. He's not in love with nature. He looks at nature with the calculating gaze of colonial capitalism. Wherever he looks, and this is Ian Watt, he sees acres that cry out for improvement. And as he settles down to the task, he glows not with noble savagery, but with purposive possession. So the entire aim is to define nature, map it, monitor his resources, and extract maximum possession out of it. And therefore, Crusoe becomes, in that sense, marked by the priority of the human over the natural. And in a sense, he also becomes an example of the Anthropocene. Now, those of you who've read Amitav Ghosh's very perceptive book called The Great Derangement, and subsequently his latest novel, Gun Island, will remember that Ghosh sees the late 17th and the 18th centuries as moments when the Anthropocene begins to emerge, when man and his activities started changing the Earth's atmosphere. And that, at this point of time, the literary imagination became, and I'm using Ghosh's word here, radically centered on the human, the individualizing imaginary in which we are trapped. So it is at this point of time that man sees himself at the center of civilization. All his imagination centers upon his image, and he takes for granted the capability and the right to alter nature for his own interests and comforts. Remember, this is the age of modernity. This is the age that will lead on to colonial expansion. This will then lead on to fossil fuels. And in the 19th century, the Anthropocene will completely take over. Now, it's very interesting to use Bruno Latour's, L-A-T-O-U-R. Bruno Latour is one of the very important critics of the post-human. And Bruno Latour has this very interesting category called purification. He uses purification, but he says that there is a purification, there is an intensity whereby the human subject and the natural object, as it were, becomes very clearly demarcated. So there's no distinction between, no relationship, as it were, or no overlap of the human subject and the natural object. They become markedly distinct from each other, from one another, rather. So Latour says that the subject is conceived as the pure subject and the object is conceived as a pure object. And if you look at Robinson Crusoe, then the speaking I as in myself, the speaking I and the first person narrative then becomes crucially important for this processing of the Anthropocene. Right. Well, take a look at this sentence. As to deliver my thoughts from daily poring upon them, my reason began to master my despondency. I began to comfort myself as well as I could. And this subjective I then looks at the object, that is nature, with a very cold, rational eye. So it is here that the eye of the Homo Economicus and the eye of the Anthropocene sort of merge into one another with a rational, calculating, exploitative gaze. How can I explore nature and exploit it? I saw what was fit for food. I saw an abundance of fowls. I saw an abundance of cocoa trees, orange and lemon and citron trees, but all wild and very few bearing any food. So nature is no longer seen as something which is identifiable with the human subject. No, nature is seen as a resource, something that must satisfy the demands of the human self. So there are therefore two EYES working, eyes as in eyes, working within Robinson Crusoe. One is the outward rationalizing eye, which looks at everything through a calculated, very unemotional prose. This is the eye of reason. And there is also the disembodied inward emotional eye, which comes forth only and only when Robinson Crusoe himself is in a crisis. For example, when he finds barley growing, he's joyous because it means that he is going to survive. When he sees the footprint, it is he that is going to be threatened. So the inward turmoil in Robinson Crusoe comes only and only when he himself is traumatized, or he himself is, as it were, in a state of anxiety or tension. Otherwise, for nature, there is no emotion. There's not a single jot of emotion. It does never talk about the beauty of the nature. It never talks about identifying with the island. And therefore, it is only and only when nature is available to him as a resource, food, tools, and building materials, that it becomes important. And we come to a very important passage where Crusoe says, the nature and experience of things dictated to me that all the good things of this world are no further good to us than they are for our use. So the classic Anthropocene, who sees nature only as important insofar as it is useful for man. So together with human equipment, nature becomes this inanimate being which must be exploited for the benefit of human nature. Not only that, Crusoe does not let nature be. He alters nature, builds confinements, changes the landscape, and therefore builds a fortification, an enclosure, and thereby starts transforming the geography of the island. Now, it is important to understand also that Crusoe always renames things, renames the island as the island of despair, renames Friday also. And therefore, at the end of the novel, if you remember that quotation which we used when we were discussing the text, Crusoe writes, I was king and lord of all this country. So the relationship between him and the country and the geography is one of absolute possession and domination. Completely as any lord of a manor in England, I had the lives of all my subjects at an absolute command. This is the ultimate fantasy of the Anthropocene, to have nature at his absolute command. And therefore, all this and the lives of all disappear for, abstract concepts of territorialization, possession, king, lord, country, my subjects, my absolute command, and my England. So, when we take a look at this idea that Robinson Crusoe is a natural man, is a man who is at one with nature, no. The reading of Robinson Crusoe absolutely runs contradictory to it. Robinson Crusoe is an Anthropocene, a novel of the Anthropocene, who looks at nature solely through the human prism. There's no bonding with nature. And he sees nature only and as a resource to be fit, to be changed, to be governed. So the relationship between Crusoe and nature is not a one-to-one relationship. It is one of power marked by dominion, marked by mapping, marked by change in territory. And it is synchronized with the idea of the economic man and the colonial man. And therefore, Rousseau's idea that, nature would teach, or Robinson Crusoe would be the great teacher of Emile, could be a very fallacious idea indeed. Now, I'm almost at the end of my discussion today, but I'd like to draw your attention to an alternative reading of Robinson Crusoe. Now, I have already told you that Robinson Crusoe has been one of the most translated and rewritten novels of the entire world. In fact, it is comparable only to the Bible in terms of its translation. And there are numerous versions of Robinson Crusoe which reread these myths. These are called, as I said, Robinsonades and anti-Robinsonades. Now, one of the most powerful anti-Robinsonades written by Michael Tournier is this entire concept of Friday. The novel was published in 1967. Now, in this particular novel, Michael Tournier inverts the relationship between nature and Robinson Crusoe. Now, in this novel, Robinson Crusoe goes into a dark, deep cave where it is suggested that he has sexual relations, or he copulates with nature, as it were. And where his semen falls, you have the rise of mandrakes. In Tournier's Friday, then, the novel, the island is nature which is alive, nature which throbs with life. And Crusoe can feel this aspect of alive nature, and therefore he communicates with it, and his heart and lungs open up to it, as does his sexuality, as it were. Therefore, the non-human nature, aspect of nature, is then reread and transformed into a more pulsating nature with whom Robinson Crusoe has a far deeper emotional and sexual bond. Now, there's a very beautiful passage which Tony writes, and I'm just going to read it out to you. He says, "A warm breath set the leaves stirring. He pictured his own lungs," and this is Crusoe, "growing outward, outside himself, like a blossoming of purple-tinted flesh, living polyparies of coral with pink membranes, sponges of human tissue." So it's as it were, it blends into nature, grows out from his body, leaps out of his anthropocentric self, and becomes at one with nature. Now, Michael Tournier, of course, is pointing out how different, how radically different the human relationship with nature potentially can be. But you know, why Robinson Crusoe has remained such a very important myth? Because this is the idea of man's lordship over nature, control over nature, man's right to transform nature, and the view of nature as totally subservient to the subjectivity of man that has endured across these few centuries. And we are only calculating the costs of this, idea of the Anthropocene and the way in which the Anthropocene has worked. As you know, as I speak today, a cyclone is devastating Gujarat. For example, we've tampered with nature, and then it is tampering back with us. So, in that sense, Robinson Crusoe becomes this, archetype of the modern man who's not at one with nature, who sees nature as a commodity and sort of existing only for himself. Right, so I've made a lot of points today. I've gone into a very dense discussion. Let me fold up. I had started with the idea that Robinson Crusoe, and this is, I had borrowed from Ian Watt, that is one of the founding myths of modernity, and it embodies three myths, as Ian Watt suggests: the myth of the dignity of labor, the myth of the Homo Economicus, or the economic man, and the myth of the natural man. Now, I've suggested that while, Crusoe foregrounds labor, as Marx notes, we cannot really say that Crusoe has any great fondness for the dignity of labor as such. For him, labor on the island is meant primarily for survival. He's a slave trader, so he has no ulterior concept of a dignity of labor. And labor is important only for him as a commodity, as we can see in his use of Zuri or Friday. I've suggested that Crusoe's myth of the Homo Economicus is a more viable myth, in the sense that, Crusoe uses his rationality, his resources of both the mind and outside the mind, to create a system, an economic system, moving from subsistence to surplus to considerable more labor and surplus. And when he leaves the island, Crusoe is on the verge of leaving as the pioneering colonizer on that island. And therefore, Crusoe's model becomes a model on which English colonialism will be based. And therefore, the myth of the Homo Economicus, the economic man, the myth of the colonizer, and the myth of the imperialist sort of conjoin with one another to create a very potent myth of Crusoe. And this is something which I'll discuss a little more when we talk about Defoe and colonialism. And finally, I've discussed the idea of Rousseau that, Robinson Crusoe is the only book which he will allow Emil to read, because it talks about absolute freedom, man's absolute empathy with nature. I have clearly shown that this idea is a false one, that Robinson Crusoe treats nature not as something with whom he has a deeper ulterior bond. Rather, he sees nature through the eyes of a cold, calculating capitalist of the Anthropocene, who will transform nature for his own benefits and who will see nature as a resource to be used solely for the sake of man. Now, in our next class, what we'll do is take a look at the issue of colonialism in Robinson Crusoe in slightly greater detail. We've also, of course, looked at it when we discussed Friday, but we will take a closer look at it. And what we will do is see how this aspect of colonialism in Robinson Crusoe has been critiqued by several Robinsonades, including certain film versions, and also most specifically by J.M. Coetzee in his novel Foe, written in 1986. So that remains to be done for the next day. For now, thank you for having listened so patiently to this entire exercise, and I hope to see all of you back tomorrow for a discussion on Crusoe and colonialism. Thank you very much, and have a very good day.